Welcome to Strategy Talk, where the editors of Strategy Page discuss current events with a splash of history. I'm Dan Masterson, host of Strategy Talk. With me today is the editor of Strategy Page, well-known military author and game designer Jim Dunnigan. Also joining us is the associate editor of Strategy Page, columnist and author Austin Bay. Welcome, Jim and Austin. It's Black Friday that we're recording this. There's I guess it's a really Black Friday in Hong Kong, Jim. What things have changed a bit since we last talked about Hong Kong. Of course, we may talk about some other things in China too, but Hong Kong has gotten a lot tenser, right, yes. Jim?
Well, yes and no. The police have withdrawn from the university that it was under siege. The students were using bows and arrows and Molotov cocktails. But basically the police said, look, you can just leave, and we'll leave. And everybody's left. Apparently a couple of students just walked out this morning, the front gate. No police, no nothing. They just walked down the street, la-di-da. I think for various reasons, China is hitting the pause button here. One thing that's going on that doesn't get a lot of attention is there is a Chinese espionage officer. Yeah, I'm talking about an officer in the MSS, whatever it is, whatever the department is that handles overseas espionage. He defected to Australia, Mr. Wang. William Wang, Wang, whatever name you want to use. Anyway, he's being debriefed. He defected over a week ago, and he appears to be the real deal. He had worked he worked all over, Asia, that region. He had a lot of good stuff on how China was subverting politics in Australia, what plans China had for the 2020 elections in Australia, and he basically worked all the hot spots. And of course, he had information on Hong Kong because he was plugged in, to the secret agent man network. Apparently, he had also some first-hand knowledge because apparently China considers Hong Kong a foreign territory, so they send the agents, who work the rest of the region into Hong Kong occasionally. But that being said, I asked on Wall Street, the street as it were. It hasn't. I'll hear more when the Christmas parties get started. That a lot of firms are bailing out of Hong Kong or making plans to do so. Now, some of them are contingency plans being updated in minute detail, meaning we can be out in 48 hours, Chief. But they're also unwinding positions, and that's when they're serious. I mean, when you untether the money or have it less tethered to China, and I think China got that message. Unlike back in the pure communist days, you got a lot of accountants in the upper echelon who can read a balance sheet, and better yet, they can read the detail pages on the financial statistics. Let me put it this way. They know how to use a Bloomberg terminal, not to give Mr. Bloomberg any publicity, but basically he still is the king of international, financial information delivery. And they basically are saying that it looks like the foreign money in Hong Kong is getting nervous. And you can tell by, again, certain movements. I mean, well, what it comes down to is what they call a quick unwind. In other words, where you can basically move your funds out of Hong Kong very quickly with minimal damage. And that's always a bad sign. You rarely see that unless there's a disaster looming. And that's what the warning signs are up all over Hong Kong. Now, that sends an important message to China, because whether they go full Tiananmen or try and wait them out, and as Austin has pointed out in his column, apparently they're going to wait until forever, until the monkeys fly, or whatever the phrase is in Chinese, because the recent vote for the municipal elections was overwhelmingly anti-China, and they had a record turnout. So there's a message there. Mr. Trump would understand that. And I know, speaking of Trump, yeah, he finally, he and the Congress got together on something in very expeditious speed, a resolution not just censoring China on Hong Kong, but implementing, how should I put it, punishments. If China does not abide by the 1997 agreement with Britain at the end of the lease for its lease for Hong Kong, where they basically kept most of the key Chinese in Hong Kong and key foreigners, although 500,000 left at that point. They didn't trust the Chinese even then, and a lot of them are telling their folks who stayed, "I told you so." But anyway, the we're basically holding holding their feet to the fire. There will be sanctions if they violate it. And the worst sanction of all is the press releases about we're imposing sanctions because China has again, broken its word, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. China likes to do these things on the down low, quietly. They disappear people. They arrest people on other charges. For example, there was notorious case a few years back of kidnapping booksellers and publishers in Hong Kong, literally kidnapping them and taking them to China and then charging them in China. Now, all these guys, when they finally got back, and that was after months, and they were basically given a third degree, as it were, some of them said, "No, we were kidnapped." Others, they kept their mouth shut in a way that, all right, you were kidnapped too, cool. China didn't give it any publicity in China. It did continue to get publicity in Hong Kong, but it never made big news around the world. I said, "Oh, there's China. You know how they are about censorship." Well, that was about a program that came to a head recently in Hong Kong of intimidating the Hong Kongese. And the Chinese thought they could pull it off, but as Austin pointed out, the recent election on the 24th, that was an enormous setback for China. Because if they're intimidating the Hong Kongers, it isn't reflected in the voting, and that's what they have used as a parameter before this, before the protest this year. They were getting more support in the polling. I mean, there were more pro-China people being elected to this. This is the local government. They take care of the municipal, getting the streets repaired and the garbage picked up, stuff like that. But it is the one vote in Hong Kong which reflects the attitudes of the Hong Kong people, and right now it's decidedly against China, and China feels it's getting out of control. In other words, even if there are no more demonstrations, China has lost the confidence, as it were, of the Hong Kong people. And if they see these how should I put, quick departure plans remaining in place, in effect put on a hair trigger, that's bad news, because it means especially the foreign firms, they don't trust China to keep its word, or to not come back and try and do a full Tiananmen and end it once and for all. Now, the next thing you'll see is China trying to entice people to move to Shanghai. But therein lies the problem. One reason Hong Kong was a popular middleman for foreign banks and foreign and other countries having financial dealings and trade dealings with financing trade and what have you with China through Hong Kong, was that you could trust the courts there, the chancery courts and what have you, because for one thing, again, they had the tradition with the British, which is again why Hong Kong grew to live up to its name, which means rich port, lucky port. That British administration, it may have been foreign, but it was honest. And you didn't get that too much in that part of the world. It wasn't just China. And foreigners felt confident, especially bankers and people investing large sums of money. They felt comfortable doing it through Hong Kong, because as long as as disputes were adjudicated in Hong Kong, they knew if they got screwed legally, and they lost in court, it was, all right, we we made a bad decision, but it wasn't because somebody bought off the judge. Well, now some of the judges who have been invited, they invite foreign judges to sit on those courts, and rotate. They pay them a lot, and it's a prestigious thing, and it's interesting, and it's part of the allure. There's not just one bunch of judges. There's a constant rotation. Well, some of these are saying, well, I don't think we'll come. I don't think we feel comfortable, et cetera, et cetera. So China is losing things that has been built up over two decades now, and they have to decide: are they going to flush it all down the toilet, or are they going to try something else? And I think especially because Mr. Wang down in Oz, singing his heart out because he hasn't actually been granted asylum yet. There's always the risk that he's some sort of, ploy. But as we discovered during the Cold War, the Russians didn't do ploys like that. If you had a colonel of the KGB or the GRU in your custody, he was probably the real deal. They don't send senior intelligence operatives out there on a risky mission to deceive the Americans and never get out unless these guys were really defecting. So I'm pretty certain there are CIA representatives and representatives of intelligence agencies from other countries in the region, either in participating in the interrogations, debriefs, or listening in on the spot and passing notes, as it were, asking him about this, asking him about that. He apparently is credible. And the other interesting thing about not just his information, but is he the first of many, or what are the special circumstances that caused him to flip? If it is true that a lot of the agents are getting nervous about China's foreign policy and aggressive espionage, because the Americans are pushing back now, and that's encouraged a lot of our allies to push back. One thing, there have been a lot of our allies have been criticizing American foreign policy and domestic policy. But one thing they agree on is when you push back against China or North Korea and it works, hey, we're behind you on that. At the very least, we'll keep our mouth shut. And that is a big success, but it's got China worried that it may not end. If there's a change of government in the United States, because there wasn't even a lot of domestic criticism of our government for the new get hard on China, get tough on China routine, because it was getting results. And you don't win elections by saying, well, that's somehow bad news. So, something's been started in the United States, which everybody around the world was afraid, or at least in the major trading countries, of moving forward. And really, the United States has the biggest exposure. We're their biggest foreign customer. We're their biggest financial partner. We're biggest everything. So if we take the lead, which we have, and say, come on, it's time to clean up your act, and that basically opens the floodgates. So I think the most ominous aspect of what's going on in Hong Kong right now is nothing is going on. In other words, China has put everything. All right, let's halt. Let's not, let's not start a fire we don't want to fail to put out. Let's stop and think. So I don't know how long this timeout is going to last, but I suspect the outcome is not going to be a Tiananmen.
Dan?
Yes.
Let me quickly comment on something Jim said about the accommodation operations in Hong Kong. And he mentioned about some of the people that had been kidnapped and taken into People's Republic of China, Communist China. I read anecdotally, I'm going to say about maybe it was 5, and then I think about it, the article I read about this some time ago, and one of the men who was kidnapped had run a small bookstore, but it was very popular in Hong Kong for a while. I believe it. I'm correct on that. Again, it's from memory. He was a small shop owner. Everybody figured out what had happened, and where he'd been taken. It was supposed to intimidate everybody. It angered people more than I'm sure it intimidated them, but it also angered them. Now, there are a lot of reasons for the Hong Kong populace to be angry and upset with Red China, and Jim covered a slew of them. But you saw that anger, disgust, and pushback reflected on November 24th in that district council election. And the district councils, Jim said, yeah, they're not the LegCo, the legislative group that really is. Red China has already messed with the way the selections made to that board. But the district councils do reflect democratic sentiment, public sentiment. You had almost 75% of the population vote, 71% you'll see in some reports, but it turns out maybe it's somewhere between 71 and 75% of the voting age population showed up, and it was overwhelmingly for the 452 seats that were at stake in 18 different districts. 90% of it went to the pro-democracy movement. And that's with at least one, maybe two. It's a little bit murky, but there's still at least one People's Armed Police, essentially a mechanized police division, sitting over there in Shenzhen, which is just northwest of Hong Kong, and also with there are People's Liberation Army troops inside Hong Kong now. They're there at PLA headquarters, which is the old British Prince of Wales barracks. I believe on one strategy talk, I admitted that I had been in there and drunk a cup of tea when it was still British military headquarters there. But they're stationed there, and they have been since '97, but they rarely appear outside of garrison. But there were a few incidents of the PLA personnel during this past few months since the first demonstrations were marches. They weren't demonstrations, they were marches in April, but it really kicks off after the 30th anniversary of Tiananmen Square this past June. Since then, on a few occasions, you'd see People's Liberation Army soldiers. They were out picking up debris from protests. Well, they were out there. It was a show of force, one of these subtle Chinese shows of force that Jim referred to. That didn't work either. Now, Red China bet on intimidation. They also bet on slow motion, erosion, a slow invasion of Hong Kong's autonomy politically and legally. You can make a direct analogy to the concrete islands, how long it takes to build those damn islands down in the fake islands down in the South China Sea. That's a slow invasion as well. And in 2016, that Hague Arbitration Court on the UN Law of the Sea, the Philippines had filed, 2013, I think is when they filed it. But certainly that's when they made the initial complaint about communist China encroaching on the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. It's EEZ, and more than that, they came in, build an artificial island on a reef, on a sea feature, and then claim it's as Chinese as Shanghai. They got a decision, Philippines did, in 2016 from the Hague Arbitration Court that saying 98% agreement with the Philippines, China's encroached. China just ignored it. Now, that's a bad signal to all of Southeast Asia and the South China Sea. It's a bad signal for everybody, but it's also a signal everybody in Hong Kong understood. I'm going to take 2016 as a start point. There were already indications of pervasive Chinese spying in the United States and Canada in 2016. Jim, correct me if I'm wrong on this, I think it was 2015, wasn't it? Maybe late 2014, that the Office of Personnel Management was hacked by China. And that's right. I know you wrote a lot about it.
There were several ways, but there was the big one that really got everybody.
Right. I'm saying that's June 2015, but the one where they basically got between 4 and 5 million files of a lot of DOD personnel, soldiers and civilians, DOD personnel, many of them retired. And I know that this is on strategy page. Jim wrote this. I've plugged this into some things I've written as well. The point there is that a lot of retired or former service members go into other security agencies in the federal government, also in state security agencies. Just think about it. A guy who's been a good rifleman in an infantry outfit for 4 years, he gets out. He's got 4 years of quality service. He's shown he knows how to make decisions in tough situations, even if he's never been in combat. You know, he's a disciplined individual. State police, ICE, border patrol, and then you start moving into, of course, CIA, DIA, and the like. These are people they're interested in, especially special operations, personnel with special operations experience. And right there, you've got threads with that hack of how to blackmail a massive net of U.S. not just espionage but security personnel. And it's China that did it. The blame, in large portion, I think, can be laid on the Office of Personnel Management. They had an incompetent leading it. She was a Democratic Party stalwart and spent more time politicking and didn't realize that her job was, one of her chief jobs was to secure those personnel files. Now, that was a huge alert to everyone saying, wait a minute, hey, our whole policy towards Red China, and look, I thought it was worth trying circa 2002, maybe even 1997, is that if we engaged them economically and they were rewarded, there would be liberalization or modernization. No, all it did, especially when Xi Jinping takes over, is now we've got money and now we're going to use muscle. And they start that and really accelerate that about 2012. About the time that Xi's cadre takes over the Politburo. And then talking about espionage, it's global, but they were focused on us. 2015, 2016, we start getting more indications just how pervasive Chinese spying is at our research institutes. 2017, now I think that's when this starts very seriously looking at some of our medical facilities. And the big break in that, unfortunately, came out this year. And it was MD Anderson Cancer Hospital at Texas Medical in Houston, and Emory University's research outfit in Atlanta that got the publicity initially. China had focused. Well, both of those are two outstanding medical research institutions. The Chinese were stealing proprietary information from both of them, and they were. If you caught it in the mainstream media, oh well, there they are, just two of them. It turns out, and this has come out in the last few months, there were somewhere between 70 and 80 institutions that finally got investigated by the FBI, and there were signs in all of them of, if not direct espionage, meddling and use of monetary incentives to co-opt researchers. Also, a system to try to plant sympathizers as researchers or catalogers or data managers. So to relate this to what Jim said, no, I don't think it's going to stop now, because enough people, no matter what their political views are, have seen that their own individual institutions have already been penetrated and co-opted or are potentially targets for this kind of pervasive intelligence. And I was amused. I didn't know Jim was going to do this when he brought up that Australian defector. I read about that. first read about maybe just 5 or 6 days ago, and it was in an Australian website, one of the Australian big newspapers. And my first thought, too, was similar to yours, Jim. Gee, this is interesting. Is this fake? But one of the things in this report I read was that this Mr. Wang was frustrated and upset. One of the many things that had motivated him was Hong Kong and what was going on in Hong Kong. Yeah, that could be platitudes, but there were just too many indicators in here that you compared him to a KGB colonel. I think this guy is a big league, major foreign directorate type spy. The Australians certainly seem to think that he is, and he's got a ton of operational level knowledge about Chinese operations, apparently throughout the Pacific Basin. That would include us in Canada too. I'm wondering how I'm sure all Five Eyes are with this, and I'm using the Five Eyes out of World War II, the Anglosphere spying co-op with Canada, U.S., Great Britain, New Zealand, and Australia. Interesting that he defected to the Aussies too, but he apparently had some operational contact with the Aussies. If that guy is the treasure trove of data, we're going to be able to make some real inroads much more quickly than I thought we would against this pervasive spying, strategic spying by the Red Chinese. One last comment, and Jim got this, did a good job on pointing this out. You were talking, though, Jim, primarily about the financial unwinding in investments on this.
Yes.
That's going on.
Yes.
But some of the supply chain unwinding, and Trump gets credit for this, starts in 2017.
Yeah.
It's slow, and that's harder to unwind. I know it's all hard to unwind, okay? But supply chain stuff, now you got to start getting, where can I move the manufacturing dies for this widget? It's in China now, and they pretty much work, but I got to go find someplace else. If not, I can't do it in the United States or Canada, maybe Mexico. But we're going to have to. There's physical change here as well as also infrastructure to have the transportation infrastructure to move whatever the widget is. But that starts in 2017, and as far as I can tell, it's really started to accelerate earlier this year. That's a huge message to China, Dan. A big one, which is I'm being figurative here when I say this. It could be literal, but it says I'd rather make it in Mexico than in Hainan, on Hainan Island or whatever. That would be the business decision, which is okay. Well, we're going to commit to Mexico or wherever, Mexico, Colombia, Belize. I'm moving it to the Western Hemisphere instead of making it in China. That really does ultimately have an effect on the stability of the Beijing regime, because they've been able to buy people off by giving them enough cash to buy, MacBooks and iPhones and things like that, have access to it. And you start crushing down the money, you also are moving the money down that they have to spend on weapons. Slower process, but maybe the boys in Beijing are really smart enough to say, hey, it'd be nice for us to have some cash instead of a war. I'll leave it at that.
Jim, how is this affecting the other countries surrounding China that are worried about China?
They're happy. As Austin was pointing out, with all that that manufacturing, that industrial activity being moved out of China, a lot of it is simply going next door to Vietnam, Malaysia, Thailand. These are all countries that are much more stable than China.
The Philippines. I should have said the Philippines.
Philippines, right? Exactly. Well, that is a downside because a lot of Chinese illegal hacking operations moved to the Philippines, and what else did they have? A lot of arrests. But anyway, yes, a lot of legitimate, not Chinese, but foreign countries are pulling out of China. There's also other problems in China. There's the pollution, which is getting worse and worse, and of course there is the shortage of labor. They have the one child policy for decades, and then it was the double whammy in China. First, there was the one-child policy. Whether you wanted it or not, you were only going to have one kid, especially in urban areas. Out in the countryside, you could have two. But then what happened when a huge chunk of the Chinese population in 2 decades became middle class, became affluent by Chinese standards, the first thing women do when that happens is, well, aside from buying better clothes, is they stop having a lot of kids. And that's an ancient problem. I mean, a lot of the dynasties, we can trace this back to the Romans. The middle class, the Romans would complain about, the equities, the nouveau riche, as it were. The minute they get up there, they can't expect a dynasty out of these families because the women say, all right, one and done. Or, as the English aristocracy, monarchy, not aristocracy, the aristocracy put it, one heir, one spare, and then we party. And this had real impact over history because it meant that how should I put it, the more powerful, the more talented families didn't reproduce much at all compared to the rest of the population, and it was very difficult to get these educated families, these educated clans going. And it was a real loss. But now it's catastrophic. That's why you're having the huge decline in population in places like not just Europe, but also Japan. It's catastrophic. Russia, catastrophic. That's one bad side. That's one bad side effect of getting rid of the commies. You let them get rich, so they stop having little Russians. South Korea. North Korea has a higher, reproduction rate than South Korea because there's not much else to do up there, and there's often no light at night. The Chinese are starting to suffer a huge, and it's not going to get any better, labor shortage. At the same time, they have a huge growth in the elderly population. And they have made no provisions for them because they always expected the extended family. Well, that one-child policy basically blew apart a lot of extended families, and the kids don't want to be bothered. Literally, I mean, that's considered disgraceful. But as Austin put it, when the kid has an opportunity to buy an iMac or a car, versus supporting his cranky old man. Unfortunately, they often choose the bling. At the same time, this is hitting China. They have this trade war, which is basically sucking more business out to the point where they're starting to have unemployment again. So this is not going well for them. And plus, China still has a lot of financial overhang that has been sitting there for years. I mean, for example, the huge real estate glut, or overbuilt. We joke about it in the West about there's 15 or 20 of these cities. I mean, literally, these huge high-rise apartment blocks, which have nobody living in them. So those loans are going to go belly up. They're being propped up by the government for the moment, but eventually they're not going to be able to afford it. These Chinese stock markets in mainland China are notoriously corrupt. They try to clean that up, but it's not Hong Kong. Hong Kong's the only place in China where you can buy into a reasonably honest equities market, financial markets, and so losing Hong Kong or trying to move it to Shanghai isn't really much of an option as it used to be. And at the same time, they're dealing with this huge flood of foreign investments because they look at what's happened to them already in China, where people thought it was impossible to invest in and do business in China, but they found no, it wasn't impossible, but it can be very difficult because you can't go to the courts. You have to basically develop personal relationships, and for Westerners, it's a big pain in the butt. And in the end, you might lose if you just accidentally cross, the wrong big shot. Hong Kong was the only place in China where you could basically operate on fair terms, or as we put it, Western terms. And now China is having second thoughts about flushing that down the toilet. Another thing, as I pointed out earlier, there are more people who took accounting courses and or even are accountants or economists in the senior bureaucracy. And I think now they have kept that secret because that could be explosive. The details of what's going on with those arguments, but are basically saying, look, we may not be able to afford the financial hit of a major catastrophe in Hong Kong. So if you got to give them a little democracy, that might be the cheaper way to go. Now, I'm not saying that is happening, but it has happened before where you didn't find out all these momentous arguments about change, like the economic liberalization. That was kept pretty secret before Deng, just came out here and said, all right, it's glorious to get rich. Go get it, guys. And they did.
Jim.
But now somebody's got to come out and say it's glorious to be honest.
Yeah, what you just said, Jim, is a really moderated and much more real world than I don't know. When I said either do you want cash or do you want war, and you're saying the same thing. Hey, do we want to keep the economic engine going? Do we, or do we want to make ourselves poor? Maybe we should give them some democracy. Those are where the wheels are spinning in Beijing right now, man.
Yeah, well, that's bitter tea, as they say in China. Xi, the current president for life, had basically said, we're above all this stuff. Democracy is no good, et cetera, et cetera. And he basically stuck his neck out in trying to put the boot on Hong Kong, and now he's got burned toes to show for it. And his financial advisor is telling him, well, it might get worse. You might lose the whole leg. So maybe you better consider either backing off or learning how to use crutches. And with this latest vote, that was a big deal. I mean, it was even more lopsided than many optimists believed it would be. I mean, people were getting sick and tired of the constant, traffic, tourist business was off. I mean, your average Hong Konger was taking a hit with this months and months of unrest. But, there's resolve there. They're saying, look, it's now or never. And apparently now they're encouraged because they feel, well, we got the vote, we got the police backing off. There's hope. And boy, in a situation like that, hope is often all you got. And apparently the Hong Kong population has more hope than the Chinese government does right now, and that might be the deciding measure.
Michael Yon, let's give him some credit. Our friend in Hong Kong, Michael Yon, and both on some of his posts on his page and his live streams on Facebook, but also he and I've exchanged emails about this. He told me that this was the sentiment that was building up. Now, of course, everybody's got their own direct anecdotal understanding of what's going on in the streets, but he'd been all over the area, and he kept telling me, he says, they really are. It's not just the young. There are a lot of people here that said, hey, the deal was through 2047, and we'd see, and what was going to happen. They're meaning the Politburo, Communist China, Beijing, is going to, pull a full mainland on us, and we're just going to be part of the prison state. We're not going to put up with it. And son of a gun, look at that vote on the 24th. He's not the only one, but he was certainly very vehement that the overwhelming adult age population in Hong Kong supported the pro-democracy movement. So there you go.
Well, that's a good place to wrap it up, and we'll put Hong Kong to bed for a little while and come back to it later, I'm sure. All right, we'll talk with you gentlemen next time.
Bye. Dan.
Take care.